Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The smell of fresh baked apple pie should have been comforting. Instead, it made my stomach turn as I stood in my grandmother's kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, watching her pull another perfect dessert from the oven, the fourth one this month. The fourth pie for the fourth funeral. Because my grandfather keeps dying, and nobody seems to remember but me. Before you click away thinking I've lost my mind, just listen. Please. I need anyone to tell me I'm not going crazy. Because either everyone I love is playing the world's most elaborate prank, or something is very, very wrong in this small Midwestern town. And now, the story begins. It started on a Tuesday, October 3rd to be exact. I remember because I'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift at Mercy Hospital in Des Moines when Mom called. Her voice was steady, practiced, the way it gets when she's delivering bad news. "Honey, it's Grandpa Joe. He passed this morning." The drive to Cedar Falls took 2 hours. 2 hours of autumn cornfields blurring past my window, golden and dying under the October sun. 2 hours to process that my grandfather, the man who taught me to fish at Silver Lake, who sneaked me root beer floats when Grandma wasn't looking, was gone. The funeral was Thursday. Small town, quick arrangements. Grandpa Joe looked peaceful in his casket at Morrison's funeral home, wearing his favorite Navy suit, the one with the American flag pin he got from his VFW post. The whole town showed up. That's how it is in Cedar Falls. Population 4,132, where everyone knows everyone, and death brings casseroles. Mrs. Henderson from the diner brought her famous green bean casserole. Pastor Williams gave a beautiful eulogy about Grandpa's service in Vietnam. My cousin Tyler flew in from Seattle. Everything was normal, heartbreaking, but normal. I stayed the weekend to help Grandma sort through things. She was remarkably composed, already talking about maybe selling the house, moving to that senior community in Waterloo. "Your grandfather always said I'd outlive him," she said, folding his flannel shirts into boxes for goodwill. Stubborn man was right about everything. I drove back to Des Moines Sunday night, exhausted and sad, but accepting. Death is part of life. I see it every day at the hospital. Grandpa was 83. He'd lived a good life. Then the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week later, Mom called again. Same time, same steady voice. "Honey, it's Grandpa Joe. He passed this morning." I actually laughed, a sharp, confused sound. "Mom, that's not funny." "What's not funny?" "Sweetheart, I know this is hard. We buried him last week." Silence. Then, carefully, like she was talking to a psychiatric patient, and trust me, I know that tone, she said, "Katie, are you feeling all right? You've been working too many shifts. Maybe you dreamed." But I hadn't dreamed it. I had the funeral program in my purse. I had a picture on my phone of me standing next to his casket with Grandma. I had dirt under my fingernails from helping lower him into the ground at Riverside Cemetery. Yet, when I drove back to Cedar Falls, breaking every speed limit, there was Grandpa Joe, in a casket, at Morrison's funeral home, wearing the exact same Navy suit with the exact same American flag pin, and everyone, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Tyler, who'd supposedly flown back to Seattle, acted like this was the first time. Mrs. Henderson brought the same green bean casserole. Pastor Williams gave the same eulogy, word for word. I know because I'd recorded part of it the first time to send to my brother Mark, who couldn't make it from Afghanistan. I tried showing them the video. My phone had no recording. I tried showing them the funeral program. My purse was empty. The picture of me next to the casket? It wasn't on my phone. But I remembered every single detail. The second funeral proceeded exactly like the first. Every conversation, every tear, every hymn. I stood there in the same black dress I'd worn the week before, watching my family mourn a man they'd already buried, and felt like I was losing my mind. This time, I didn't go back to Des Moines. I called in sick, something I never do, and stayed in Cedar Falls. I needed to understand what was happening. I spent the next days documenting everything, taking pictures, videos, making notes. I visited Grandpa's grave at Riverside Cemetery, took a photo of the headstone. Joseph William Patterson, 1941-2024, beloved husband, father, grandfather. I stayed at my parents' house, in my old room with the faded butterfly wallpaper. Everything seemed normal, painfully, perfectly normal. Dad went to work at the John Deere dealership. Mom taught her third-grade class at Lincoln Elementary. The town kept spinning on its axis like nothing strange had happened. Then Tuesday came again. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Mom's phone rang at 7:43 a.m. I watched her face change, watched her coffee mug pause halfway to her lips. She looked at me with those steady eyes. "Katie, it's Grandpa Joe. He's dead," I finished. She blinked. "How did you—" "Because he died last Tuesday, and the Tuesday before that." This time, I didn't let her dismiss me. I pulled out my phone, showed her the pictures of his grave. But when I opened my photo gallery, nothing. Every single image I'd taken was gone. The videos, the notes, everything. Like they'd never existed. But I knew they had. I remembered taking them. I remembered the way the morning sun hit his headstone. I remembered the fresh flowers, pink roses from Grandma's garden, already wilting on the grave. The third funeral was identical. Morrison's funeral home. Navy suit, American flag pin, green bean casserole. Pastor Williams starting with, "We gather here today to celebrate the life of Joseph Patterson, a man who served his country with honor." This time, I tried something different. During the service, I stood up. "This is the third time we've done this," I announced to the packed funeral home. "Grandpa Joe died on October 3rd, then October 10th, then October 17th. Today is October 24th, and we're burying him again." Silence. Every face turned to me with identical expressions of concern and confusion. Grandma reached for my hand, her papery skin soft against mine. "Poor dear," she whispered to Mom. "The grief is too much for her." They thought I was having a breakdown. Mom tried to get me to leave to go see Dr. Morrison. Yes, same Morrison family that owns the funeral home, because that's how small towns work. But I stayed. I sat through the third identical funeral, watched them lower the same casket into the same ground, throw the same dirt on the same grave. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in Grandma's living room. She'd invited me to stay, worried about my episode, and stared at the photos covering every surface. Grandpa in uniform. Grandpa on his wedding day. Grandpa holding baby me at the hospital the day I was born. At 3 a.m., something strange happened. I was looking at their wedding photo when I noticed something. A detail I'd never seen before. In the background, barely visible behind the happy couple, was a figure. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned black suit. The face was blurred, but something about it made my skin crawl. I looked at another photo. Grandpa's military graduation. There, in the back row. The same figure, same black suit, same blurred face, every single photo. This figure was in every picture of Grandpa Joe, from his childhood on the farm to last year's Christmas dinner. Always in the background. Always watching. Always blurred just enough that you couldn't make out features, but clear enough to know it was the same Person? Thing? I grabbed photo albums, spread them across the floor. The pattern was undeniable. This thing had been following my grandfather his entire life. And now, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, measured. Grandma never came downstairs at night. Her knees couldn't handle it. The footsteps reached the bottom, turned toward the living room. I held my breath, waiting. Grandpa Joe walked in, not ghostly or transparent, solid, real, wearing his favorite flannel pajamas, the ones Grandma had donated to Goodwill after the first funeral. He looked at me, smiled that crooked smile I'd loved my whole life, and sat in his recliner. Can't sleep, Katybug. That was his nickname for me, Katybug. Nobody else had ever called me that. Grandpa? My voice came out as a whisper. Of course it's me. Who else would it be? He picked up the TV remote, started flipping channels. Your grandma's got me watching these cooking shows. Can you believe it? 83 years old, and she's trying to learn how to make sushi. But you're dead. He paused, looking at me with those blue eyes that were exactly like my mom's. Am I? We buried you 3 times. Huh. He considered this, then shrugged. Well, I feel pretty good for a dead man. You want some cocoa? I was thinking about making some. He stood up, headed for the kitchen. I followed, unable to process what was happening. He moved around the familiar space, getting mugs, heating milk, adding chocolate. Everything exactly how he'd always done it. Grandpa, what's happening? Why do you keep dying? He stirred the cocoa thoughtfully. You ever hear the story about the day I was born, Katybug? I had, dozens of times. Born during the worst blizzard in Iowa history. The doctor couldn't make it to the farm. His mother delivered him herself by candlelight. There was someone else there, he continued, not waiting for my answer. Mom never talked about it, but I remember. Not the being born part, but after. There was a man in a black suit standing in the corner. Mom couldn't see him, but I could. He's been there ever since. The man in the photos. Grandpa nodded. You can see him now too, can't you? That means it's almost time. Time for what? He handed me the cocoa. It was perfect. Extra marshmallows. Just how I liked it. Time for the deal to end. Grandpa led me to his study. A room I'd rarely entered as a kid. It smelled like pipe tobacco and old books, though Grandpa had quit smoking before I was born. He pulled a leather journal from behind a false panel in the bookshelf. The kind of hidden compartment that belonged in mystery novels, not in my grandfather's ordinary Iowa farmhouse. October 31st, 1941, he read from the first page. I was born dead. The story he told wasn't the one I'd grown up hearing. Yes, there was a blizzard, yes, the doctor couldn't make it. But the baby, my grandfather, hadn't survived the birth. He'd come out blue and still, the cord wrapped around his neck. Mom was dying too, Grandpa continued, his voice steady like he was reading a grocery list. Bleeding too much. Dad had gone for help, but got stuck in the snow 2 miles away. It was just her and the baby, me, both dying in that cold farmhouse. That's when the man in the black suit appeared. He made her a deal. Her life for mine. A simple trade. She refused, said she'd rather die than lose her baby, so he made another offer. The baby would live, grow up, have a full life, marriage, children, grandchildren, the whole American dream. But every October, for 1 month, he'd have to die, over and over, as many times as the watcher decided. The watcher. Grandpa pointed to the wedding photo on his desk. The blurred figure in the background seemed to shift slightly, though that was probably my imagination. That's what Mom called him. He's been watching ever since, making sure the deal stays intact. And every October since I turned 21, I die. Usually just once, maybe twice. But this year, 4 times so far. And it's only the 24th. Grandpa closed the journal. 7 more days to go. I tried to process this. My rational mind, the mind trained in science and medicine, rejected every word. But I'd seen him die. I'd been to his funerals. I'd watched them lower him into the ground. Why doesn't anyone remember? That's part of the deal. Only one person can remember. The person who'll carry the burden next. It was my mom until she passed. Then it went to someone else. Never knew who. Now it's you. But why me? He smiled, that sad, crooked smile. Because you're the only one who ever really saw me, Katie Bug. Not the farmer, not the veteran, not the grandfather. You saw Joe. Just Joe. And you're the only one strong enough to handle the truth. I wanted to argue, but he continued. Tomorrow, I'll die again. Probably around breakfast. It's usually mornings. Your grandma will call your mom. The funeral will be Thursday. Mrs. Henderson will bring green bean casserole, and you'll be the only one who remembers this conversation. So we just keep doing this? Forever? Not forever. The deal ends when I choose to stay dead. When I don't come back. He looked out the window at the cornfields, silver in the moonlight. But if I do that before October ends, the deal breaks, and everyone who's alive because I lived. Your mom, you, your brothers, your cousins, you all go with me. The cocoa turned cold in my hands. That's insane. That's the price of cheating death, Katie Bug. You can't break the rules without consequences. We sat in silence until dawn painted the sky pink and orange. Then, at exactly 7:43 a.m., Grandpa clutched his chest, gasped once, and G'd in his chair. I sat there watching the sun rise over the cornfields, holding my dead grandfather's hand, and waited for Grandma to wake up and find him. The 4th funeral was the hardest. Not because of the repetition. I'd almost gotten used to that, but because I knew the truth. I stood there in Morrison's funeral home, listening to Pastor Williams deliver the same eulogy, watching my family cry the same tears, and I finally understood. This wasn't torture. It was mercy. Every time Grandpa died, they got to say goodbye. Fresh grief, yes, but also fresh love. Fresh memories. The pain was real, but so was the celebration of his life. Over and over they got to remember how much he meant to them, how much they loved him. After the burial, I stayed behind, waited until everyone left, even the groundskeepers. Then I sat by his grave and talked to the air. I know you're there, I said to nothing. The watcher, the thing in the black suit. I can feel you. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Not gradually, instantly. My breath came out in clouds despite the afternoon sun. And then, like a TV coming into focus, he was there. Not a he, exactly. Not anything I could properly describe. The black suit was real enough, but what was inside it wasn't. It was absence shaped like a person, a hole in reality wearing vintage clothing. You're early, it said without a mouth. The Patterson line usually doesn't see me until their 40s. Yeah, well, I've always been an overachiever. Stanford Medical School at 22, residency at Mercy before 25. I know who you are. Catherine Patricia Patterson. The way it said my name made my bones ache. I've been watching your family for 83 years. You're the strongest one yet. Then you know I'm going to ask for a better deal. Something like laughter, if laughter could freeze your blood. Your great-grandmother tried that. I don't negotiate. But times change. Medicine's advanced. We can prevent the kind of birth complications that would have killed my grandfather. The original deal doesn't make sense anymore. Death always makes sense, but suffering doesn't. I stood up, surprised my legs held me. Every October, my family suffers. They mourn him over and over, even if they don't remember. That grief is real, even if the memories aren't. You're feeding on their pain. I feed on nothing. I simply am. Then what's the point? Why the elaborate system? Why not just take him and be done with it? The watcher moved closer. This close, I could see through it to the graves behind. Because your great-grandmother was clever. She added conditions I didn't expect. Your grandfather must choose to stay dead, and he must do so out of love, not despair. Every October, he gets that choice. Every October, he chooses to return. Because if he doesn't make it to November, everyone his life touched ceases. Yes, rather brilliant, really. She turned my deal into a prison. I cannot claim him fully until he gives himself freely, and he cannot give himself without destroying everyone he loves. I thought about all those photos, the watcher lurking in every happy moment. So, you're trapped too, for now. It tilted its head, or the space where a head should be. But you're different, Catherine. You see the pattern. You could convince him. To let go? To kill us all? To trust. Don't you think it's suspicious that everyone dies if he stays dead? That was never my condition. That was his fear, his assumption. Your great-grandmother's love became his chain. He returns not from love, but from terror. Terror of losing you all. My mind raced. You're saying the consequence isn't real? I'm saying nothing, but consider. What kind of deal requires someone to die repeatedly just to live? What kind of love demands that suffering? Before I could respond, it was gone. Not disappeared. Just gone, like it had never been there. The temperature returned to normal. The October sun felt warm on my face. I drove to Grandma's house where she was already baking. Apple pie, of course. The fourth one this month. She smiled when she saw me, flower in her silver hair. "Katie, perfect timing. Can you help me with the crust?" I helped her roll dough, cut apples, mix cinnamon and sugar. Normal grandmother-granddaughter things. Except I kept thinking about what the watcher had said. About patterns and prisons and trust. That night, Grandpa appeared again. Same flannel pajamas, same crooked smile. But this time, I was ready. "We need to talk about the deal," I said. "Nothing to talk about. It is what it is. What if it isn't? What if you've been wrong about the consequences? What if staying dead doesn't kill us all?" His face went pale. "You've seen him, the watcher. He says great-grandma trapped you both, that your fear is keeping the cycle going, not the original deal. You can't trust him, Katie Bug. He's death itself." "No," I said, remembering the void in that suit. "He's something else, something that doesn't understand life or death, just existence. And I think he's as tired of this as you are." Grandpa sat in his recliner, suddenly looking all of his 83 years. "What if you're wrong? What if I stay dead and you all disappear? Then at least we'll have chosen. At least it'll be our decision, not some deal made in a blizzard before you were even born." I took his weathered hands in mine. "Grandpa, how many more times can you do this? How many more Octobers?" "As many as it takes to keep you safe." "But we're not safe. We're trapped. All of us, even if the others don't know it. We're living in a loop, a prison made of love and fear." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, wind rustled through the cornfields. Halloween was coming, just 7 days away. The end of October, the end of the cycle, at least for this year. "If I choose to stay dead," he said finally, "it has to be before November, before the month ends. I know. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong. But Grandpa, what if I'm right?" The next morning, October 25th, he died again. The 5th time. But when I got to Morrison's funeral home, something was different. The casket was empty. People stood around, confused. Grandma clutched her purse, looking lost. Mom held Dad's hand, whispering frantically. Pastor Williams flipped through his Bible like it might explain the missing body. I stepped outside, and there he was. Grandpa Joe, translucent in the morning sun, standing next to the watcher. "I'm thinking about it," he told me, though his mouth didn't move. "About trusting, about letting go." "Thinking's good," I said, "but not deciding, not yet. I need more time." The watcher said nothing, but I sensed impatience, anticipation. It was hard to read emotions in a void. By afternoon, Grandpa's body was back in the casket. Everyone pretended the morning's confusion hadn't happened, the way small towns pretend uncomfortable truths don't exist. The funeral proceeded as normal, the fifth identical funeral, except I knew it might not be identical much longer. October 26th, he died at dinner. Just fell face first into Grandma's pot roast. Sixth time. October 27th, he died in his sleep. Peaceful. Seventh time. October 28th, he died watching the Iowa Hawkeyes lose to Wisconsin. Seemed appropriate. Eighth time. October 29th, he died in the garden, planting bulbs for spring flowers he might never see. Ninth time. Each time, the funerals got stranger. Glitches in the pattern. Sometimes the casket was empty. Sometimes there were two grandpas, one in the casket, one sitting in the pews. Sometimes Pastor Williams would stop mid-eulogy, confused, like he'd forgotten why he was there. The town was unraveling. The perfect repetition was breaking down. October 30th, the day before Halloween. I sat with Grandma as she baked her 10th apple pie of the month. She looked at me with eyes that suddenly seemed too clear, too knowing. "He's dying a lot this year, isn't he?" she said. My heart stopped. "You remember?" "Starting to. Bits and pieces. Like a dream you can't quite catch." She pulled the pie from the oven. Perfect, like always. "Is it time?" "I don't know. I think it is." She set the pie on the cooling rack. "I've loved that man for 62 years. Loved him through war and peace, children and grandchildren. 1,000 ordinary days and a handful of extraordinary ones. But this isn't love anymore. This is fear dressed up as love." That night, Grandpa appeared one last time. Not in flannel pajamas, but in his Navy suit, the one with the American flag pin. "Tomorrow's Halloween," he said. "I know. If I don't come back, then you don't come back." We sat together in the living room, surrounded by photographs of a life well lived. The watcher stood in the corner, patient as death itself. And maybe that's what it was. Not death, but patience. Waiting for us to understand that holding on too tight kills what we're trying to save. "Will you remember me?" Grandpa asked. "The real me, not the dying man. Every day. Even if the memories change. Even if the photos fade. Especially then." He stood up, walked to the watcher. They faced each other. The man who'd cheated death and the thing that had let him. "The deal's complete," Grandpa said. "No," the watcher replied. "The deal was never real. Your great-grandmother knew that. She couldn't trade her life for yours because you were never dead. You were always meant to live exactly this long. 83 years, 10 months, 15 days. I've just been waiting. Waiting for what? For you to stop running from the inevitable. For you to understand that death isn't the opposite of life. It's the completion of it." Grandpa looked at me one last time. "Tell them I loved them. Even if they don't remember the dying, tell them about the living." And then he was gone. Both of them. No dramatic exit, no flash of light, just absence where presence had been. October 31st. Halloween. I woke in my childhood bed to the sound of Grandma humming in the kitchen. Not baking pies, making breakfast. Bacon and eggs and normalcy. "Morning, Katie," she said when I came downstairs. "You're up early." Couldn't sleep. Excitement about tonight? I bought full-size candy bars for the trick-or-treaters. Your grandfather always insisted on... She paused, confused. That's strange. I can't remember what I was saying. The photos on the walls had changed. Grandpa was still in them, but the watcher was gone. Every single image was clear, clean, free of that lurking shadow. But as I watched, Grandpa's image began to fade too. Not all at once, just softly, gently, like morning mist. By noon, the photos were just of Grandma. Beautiful shots of a life fully lived, but alone. The town forgot Joe Patterson had ever existed. The grave at Riverside Cemetery bore only Grandma's name, waiting for her time. But I remembered. I remember. Every October, I remember the grandfather who died 11 times in 1 month to learn that letting go isn't giving up. It's giving forward, passing the torch, trusting that love survives even when memory doesn't. They say everyone dies twice. Once when your heart stops, and once when someone says your name for the last time. But what if you could die 11 times and still leave something behind? What if the real ghost isn't the one who haunts, but the one who can't let go? I still visit Cedar Falls every October. Grandma's gone now too, buried in that plot at Riverside Cemetery. But sometimes, on Halloween night, when the cornfields whisper secrets to the Iowa wind, I swear I smell apple pie. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear him call me Katybug. The Watcher? I see him sometimes too, not in photos, in hospitals. Standing in corners of terminal wards, waiting, patient, not cruel, not kind, just inevitable. And I've learned that's okay. Some things are supposed to end. That's what makes them precious in the first place. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The thing that makes me question everything. When I look at old photo albums from other families in Cedar Falls, I see him, the Watcher, in the background of their pictures too. At weddings, birthdays, graduations, always there, always waiting. How many deals has he made? How many families in this small Iowa town are living on borrowed time, dying and forgetting, dying and forgetting? How many October secrets are buried in Riverside Cemetery? And why? Why can I still remember? Maybe because someone needs to. Maybe because every story needs a witness. Or maybe because the deal isn't really over. Maybe it never ends. It just passes from one generation to the next, one October to another, one death to the next rebirth. So I'm telling you this story, writing it down, recording it. Because someday, maybe you'll wake up and everyone will be talking about a funeral you swear already happened. Maybe you'll see a shadow in old photographs that shouldn't be there. Maybe you'll smell apple pie in October and wonder why it makes you sad. And if that happens, remember this story. Remember that death isn't the enemy. The enemy is fear. The enemy is holding on so tight that you squeeze the life out of living. My grandfather died 11 times to teach me that. What will you die for? And more importantly, what will you live for after you let go? Sweet dreams. Story number 2. Listen, I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for 3 weeks now. You know how some stories start with "this really happened" and you roll your eyes? Well, this time it's different. Because I have proof, I have photos, and I have something else. Something I shouldn't have taken. But before I show you what I found 13 miles from Boston, in a place that doesn't exist on any map, I need you to promise me something. Promise you'll listen to the whole thing, even when it gets uncomfortable, even when you want to turn it off and pretend you never heard it, because someone needs to know, in case something happens to me like it happened to the others. Are you still listening? Good. Then let me tell you how it started. And now, the story begins. The smell of old coffee filled my Honda Civic as I drove down Route 2 that October morning. 3 weeks ago, October 15th to be exact. I remember because it was my grandmother's birthday, or would have been if she was still alive. The GPS kept recalculating, which should have been my first warning, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Sarah Chen, and I worked for the Massachusetts Historical Society. My job was cataloging old properties for the state registry. Boring stuff, usually. Taking photos of colonial houses, measuring stone walls, recording dates on weathered headstones. The kind of work that makes your friend's eyes glaze over at parties. That morning, I'd received an anonymous tip. Just an email with coordinates and a single line. The Whitmore Estate, 1743, never catalogued. Now, you have to understand something about Massachusetts history. We're obsessive about it. Every building from before 1800 is documented, photographed, preserved, protected. The idea that there was an estate from 1743 that we'd somehow missed? Impossible. But the coordinates were specific, exactly 13 miles from Boston Common. I checked 3 times. What I didn't tell you before is that I'd been having dreams about this place for weeks before the email arrived. Dreams of walking through autumn woods, following a spiral path toward something that waited in the center. In the dreams, I could smell wood smoke and something else. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. I'd wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth and dirt under my fingernails, even though I'd showered before bed. The email address that sent the coordinates? It was from my own account. An email I'd sent to myself 3 days before I consciously decided to investigate the property. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., a time when I'm always asleep. When I checked my sent folder, it wasn't there, but the received email remained, impossible to delete. The GPS led me off Route 2 onto Millbrook Road, then onto Old County Road, then onto something that wasn't really a road at all. Just 2 dirt tracks through yellowing October woods. My Civic bounced and scraped. I should have turned back. God, I should have turned back. But as I drove deeper into the woods, I noticed things that didn't belong. Street signs for roads that didn't exist. Whitmore Lane, Estrie 1743, and Memory's End Private Drive. The trees grew in unnatural patterns, their branches forming archways over the path like a cathedral ceiling. And in the bark, if you looked carefully, you could see faces, dozens of them, carved or grown into the wood, all with their mouths open in silent screams. The temperature in my car began to drop, even though the heater was running full blast. My breath came out in visible puffs. The radio started picking up stations that shouldn't exist, broadcasts in languages I couldn't identify, children singing lullabies in harmony that made my skin crawl, and what sounded like old-fashioned radio dramas about families who disappeared in the Massachusetts woods. But then I saw it. A stone pillar, covered in moss but clearly man-made, and beside it, barely visible through decades of overgrowth, an iron gate. The metalwork was intricate, beautiful even, roses and thorns twisted together in patterns that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The gate was open, not broken, just open, like it was waiting. As I approached the gate, I noticed something carved into the stone pillar. At first, it looked like random scratches from weather and age, but when I looked closer, I could make out words. Welcome home, Sarah Chen, October 15th, 2024. The carving was fresh. The stone dust was still scattered at the base of the pillar. I parked the car and grabbed my camera, my measuring tape, my notebook. Standard equipment, but also something else I hadn't planned to bring. A small brass key I'd found in my grandmother's jewelry box after her funeral. I'd been carrying it in my pocket for months, not knowing what it opened. As I stepped out of the car, the key grew warm against my leg. The path beyond the gate was clearer than it should have been. The trees formed a natural archway overhead, their branches intertwining in ways that didn't quite look random. The morning sun barely penetrated. It was like walking into twilight at 10 in the morning. But what I didn't mention before is that the path wasn't empty. There were others walking it. Translucent figures in clothing from different eras. A woman in a 1950s dress, her face a mask of terror. A man in colonial attire, his head twisted at an impossible angle. Children in modern clothes, holding hands in a chain that stretched into the darkness ahead. They didn't acknowledge me, just walked with purposeful steps toward whatever waited at the center. The path curved and curved and curved. I realized I was walking in a spiral, tightening, leading inward. My phone lost signal after the third turn. The camera started acting up after the fifth. The display showed static where the preview should be. But I kept walking. I had to see what was at the center. With each turn, more details became apparent. Lampposts that shouldn't exist lined the path. Wrought iron fixtures with glass globes that contained not light, but swirling darkness. In that darkness, I could see movement. Faces pressing against the glass from inside, mouths opening and closing like fish gasping for air. The trees grew thicker, their trunks bearing scars that looked suspiciously like claw marks, and hanging from the branches, not leaves. Photographs, thousands of them fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. Black and white portraits of families, couples, children, all with their eyes scratched out, all with their mouths drawn into forced smiles with what looked like blood-red ink. And then, there it was, the Whitmore estate. Picture a Georgian colonial mansion, but wrong. The proportions were perfect on paper. I know because I measured them later, but looking at it made my eyes water. The windows were placed exactly where they should be, but they reflected light that wasn't there. The front door was painted a deep red that seemed wet, even though it was bone dry when I touched it. But the wrongest thing? The thing that made my stomach turn? The house was pristine. Not restored, not maintained. Pristine, as if it had been built yesterday, 300 years ago. What I couldn't see at first but became clear as I approached was that the house cast no shadow. Despite the overcast sky, every other object had at least a faint shadow. The gate, the trees, even I had shadows. But the house existed in a pocket of shadowless space, as if light bent around it rather than falling on it. The windows weren't just reflecting wrong light, they were showing wrong scenes. In one window, I could see a dining room set for Christmas dinner, complete with a turkey and all the trimmings. In another, a parlor decorated for what looked like a funeral, with a small white coffin surrounded by flowers. A third window showed a nursery where a rocking chair moved by itself, back and forth, as if an invisible mother were soothing an invisible child. I took photos, dozens of them. The camera protested with each shot, the autofocus hunting for something it couldn't find. But I documented everything. The perfect white clapboard siding, the black shutters that seemed to absorb light, the brass door knocker shaped like a hand, a child's hand reaching out. The garden surrounding the house deserved its own documentation. Roses bloomed in impossible colors, deep purples that seemed to pulse with their own light, whites so pure they hurt to look at, and reds so dark they appeared black until you looked directly at them. The rose bushes were arranged in patterns that from above would probably spell out words or form symbols. At the base of each bush, the soil was disturbed, fresh, as if something had recently been buried there. A greenhouse stood to the side of the main house, its glass panels fogged from within. Through the condensation, I could see movement, shapes tending to plants that grew too tall, too fast. As I watched, a figure inside pressed its face against the glass. It was a child, maybe 8 years old, with hollow eye sockets and a mouth full of thorns. It waved at me with fingers that were too long, then disappeared back into the foggy interior. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I'm a historian. We're trained to push past superstition, to find facts, to document truth. The brass key in my pocket was now burning hot. I pulled it out, and it was glowing with a faint blue light. Without conscious thought, I found myself walking toward the front door. The key fit perfectly into a lock I hadn't noticed before, a small brass keyhole hidden in the decorative woodwork beside the door handle. I knocked. The sound echoed wrong, like it was bouncing off walls that weren't there, or passing through walls that were. I waited, counted to 30, knocked again. The door opened, not dramatically, not with a creak, it just opened, smooth and silent, and inside was impossible. The foyer was larger than the house. I know how that sounds, but I measured it. The exterior of the house was 40 feet wide. The foyer was 60. The ceiling rose 3 stories, but from outside, the house was only 2. And everything was dust-free, cobweb-free, as if someone had just finished cleaning. But what I noticed immediately was the temperature. Inside, it was summer. Warm, humid air that smelled of magnolias and something else, something rotting underneath the sweetness. My breath no longer misted, and I found myself removing my jacket despite having been cold moments before. The floor was inlaid with a compass rose made of different colored woods. But instead of pointing to magnetic north, the compass pointed to different rooms in the house. The N pointed to a doorway labeled nursery, the S to study, the E to eternal dining, and the W to weeping room. In the center of the compass, where true north should be, was a brass plaque that read, "All paths lead home." Hello? My voice didn't echo. It should have in a space that large, but it just stopped. Like the sound was absorbed, eaten. No answer. But there was music. Faint. A music box playing a lullaby I recognized but couldn't place. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder when I moved toward certain rooms, fainter when I moved away from others. I stepped inside. The floorboards didn't creak. My footsteps made no sound. It was like walking on thick carpet, but I could see it was hardwood. Polished hardwood that reflected a version of me that wasn't quite right. In the reflection, I was smiling. I wasn't smiling. Worse, my reflection seemed to be a few seconds ahead of my actual movements, as if it knew where I was going before I did. The walls were covered in portraits, dozens of them. All the same family, I assumed. The Whitmores. Each painting was labeled with a brass plate. Jonathan Whitmore, 1743. Elizabeth Whitmore, 1745. Children of Whitmore, 1750. But there were other portraits too, more recent ones. The Walker family, 1783. Timothy Morrison, surveyor, 1834. Hartford Cousins, 1892. The Riverside Five, 1951. And at the end of the hall, an empty frame with a brass plate that read, Sarah Chen, 2024. That last painting, I stood in front of it for 5 minutes, maybe 10. There were 7 children in the portrait, all between the ages of 5 and 15, I'd guess. All blonde, all blue-eyed, all smiling. But their eyes followed me, not in the cliché way paintings do. They actually moved, shifted, blinked. One of the children, a girl of about 10, stepped out of the frame. Not metaphorically. literally. Her foot crossed the boundary between paint and reality, followed by her leg, her body, her face. She stood in front of me, three-dimensional but somehow still painted. Her skin had the flat, matte finish of oils on canvas. When she spoke, her voice sounded like brushstrokes on paper. "You're early," she said, tilting her head with a motion that left after images. "Dinner isn't until sunset, but that's all right. We've been so excited to meet you, Sarah. We've been watching you for such a long time." I took a photo. In the viewfinder, the children weren't smiling. They were screaming. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide, showing not teeth but smaller faces, each one screaming in turn. Russian nesting dolls of horror. The painted girl laughed, and the sound was like canvas tearing. "Oh, you brought a camera. How wonderful. We love cameras. They help us spread so much further than we could before. Every photograph is a window. Every window is a door. And now," she gestured to my camera, "now we have so many new doors to walk through." I moved to the next room. A parlor, set for tea. Steam still rising from the china cups. Fresh steam. From tea that had to have been poured moments ago. But the house was empty. I touched the teapot. Ice cold. The tea setting was for 8. 7 cups were full of what looked like tea, but smelled like copper and roses. The 8th cup, directly across from where I stood, was empty but warm to the touch. A small card beside it read "Sarah" in flowing script. As I watched, the empty cup began to fill itself. Not with tea, but with something dark and thick that moved like it was alive. When it reached the brim, shapes formed on the surface. Faces, hands, eyes that blinked up at me from the liquid. The painted girl from the portrait was suddenly beside me, her canvas-textured hand on my arm. "You must be thirsty after your long walk," she said. "This is a special blend. Family recipe. It helps you see things as they really are. Helps you understand your place in the grand design." The dining room was set for dinner. 8 places. The food on the plates was perfect. A roasted turkey, green beans, mashed potatoes, but when I looked closer, the turkey was raw inside. Not undercooked. Raw. Blood pooled on the china. The green beans were moving, writhing. The mashed potatoes had tiny handprints in them. Child-sized handprints. But there was more. The 8th place setting, the one meant for me, held different food. A plate of what looked like photographs cut into neat squares and arranged like a meal. My photographs, I realized. The ones I'd taken outside. They'd been printed somehow and served up like dinner. When I picked up one of the photo squares, it was warm and pulsed like a heartbeat. The painted girl materialized in the chair beside mine. "You shouldn't play with your food," she scolded gently. "Eat up. You need your strength for what comes next." I documented everything, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps, but I documented it. That's what we do. We record history, even when history is wrong. The stairs to the 2nd floor were carpeted in red, deep red, the kind of red that looked wet, looked warm. I climbed them. Each step was silent. Each step felt like sinking. But I wasn't alone on the stairs. The painted girl followed, her footsteps making no sound but leaving small smudges of paint on each step. Behind her came others. The rest of the Whitmore children, stepping out of their portraits one by one. Then the adults from the other paintings, the Walker family, the surveyor, the Hartford cousins. All painted, all slightly two-dimensional, all smiling their canvas smiles as they formed a procession up the stairs. "It's been so long since we had a proper family gathering," one of them said. I couldn't tell which one, their voices all blended together like colors mixing on a palette. "We've missed having someone new to add to the collection." The hallway stretched longer than the house. I counted 17 doors. The house, from outside, could have had 4 bedrooms. Maybe 5, not 17, but now I could see that the doors weren't just numbered, they were labeled. Memory room, preservation chamber, the gallery of nows, yesterday's children, tomorrow's feast. And at the very end of the hall, a door marked Sarah's room, in fresh, wet paint. The first door was locked, so was the second. The third opened to a nursery, a beautiful nursery with a hand-carved crib and toys from the 1740s, authentic toys, museum quality, but arranged as if a child had just been playing with them. A wooden horse on its side, building blocks scattered, a porcelain doll sitting in a tiny chair having tea with invisible friends. The doll's head turned toward me, not all at once, slowly, mechanically, like it was on a timer, its painted eyes fixed on mine, its rosebud mouth opened, just a crack, just enough to show darkness inside, darkness that went too deep, but this time I heard it speak. A tiny, tinkling voice like broken music boxes. "Will you play with me, Sarah? I've been waiting so long for a new friend. The others got too old and had to go away, but you're perfect. You'll never have to grow up here. None of us do." The crib wasn't empty. Something small was moving under the blankets. The wrong size, the wrong shape. When I looked closer, I saw it wasn't a baby at all, but a collection of photographs bundled together, moving and breathing like a living thing. My photographs, the ones from my camera that I hadn't even developed yet. I backed out, tried the fourth door, a study. Books lined every wall, first editions, priceless. Books that should be in climate-controlled vaults. But here they were, accessible, readable. I pulled one out. The Proceedings of the Whitmore Family. Handwritten. The ink still wet somehow. But there were other books too. Books that shouldn't exist. The Chen family history. My family, going back generations, with details no one should know. A complete record of Sarah Chen, my life, documented day by day, including thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. The future guests of Whitmore House, a registry of names and dates, all October 15th extending decades into the future. I opened the first book. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1743. Today's date, different year. The contract is sealed, 7 for 7. The children know their purpose. The house will stand outside of time, outside of record, outside of memory, but inside. Inside we continue. We persist. We hunger. I flipped pages. Each entry was dated October 15th, every year, for almost 300 years. The handwriting never changed. The ink was always fresh. And the entries, God, the entries. 1783, the Walker family found us. 7 members, 7 meals. The house is satisfied for another year. 1834, the surveyor came alone. Not enough. The house grows restless. We must find 6 more before winter. 1892, a full family reunion. 13 cousins from Hartford. The house feasted. We could hear them in the walls for weeks. 1951. The teenagers came with their alcohol and music. 5 of them. The house took them slowly, 1 each night. Their car is in the pond now. No one will look for them here. No one ever looks here. 2003. The urban explorers brought cameras, digital ones. We learned something new. The house can travel through the images. Every photo is a doorway. Every video is an invitation. The last entry was today's date. This year. 24. The historian comes alone. She carries a camera. She takes many photos. Each one spreads our reach. Each one plants a seed. Soon, everyone who sees them will know the way, will feel the pull, will come to feed the house. Below that, in different handwriting, fresher. So fresh the ink was still wet. Sarah Chen, catalogued. But there was more. Pages and pages more, all in my own handwriting, though I'd never written them. I understand now. The house doesn't just feed on people, it feeds on memory, on documentation, on the act of recording itself. Every photograph I take doesn't just capture the house, it captures me, pieces of my essence, my humanity. And with each shot, I become more part of the house and less part of the world. The painted children aren't cruel. They're trying to save me in their way, to preserve me before I fade completely, before I become just another story no one believes. But I realize now that it's already too late. I'm writing this, but I don't remember picking up the pen. My hand moves without my conscious will, recording the truth that I can't bear to acknowledge. The house has been calling to people like me for centuries. Historians, documentarians, people whose job it is to record and preserve. We're perfect for its purposes because we can't help ourselves. We have to document everything, even when that documentation dooms us. Every photo I've taken has already been shared. Not by me, but by the house itself, spreading through digital networks like a virus. Everyone who sees them will feel the pull. Everyone who feels the pull will come looking, and everyone who comes looking will find exactly what they're searching for. I know this because I can see them now, through the windows, through the walls, through time itself. Dozens of people driving down dirt roads, following GPS coordinates that lead them here. Some are already at the gate. Some are climbing the spiral stairs. Some are reading this very account, thinking it's just a story, not realizing that by reading it, they've invited the house into their minds. The room is getting smaller. Or I'm getting larger, or both. The books are rearranging themselves, their contents shifting to accommodate new entries, new visitors, new meals for the house. And I can feel myself changing too. My edges getting softer, my colors becoming more saturated, my thoughts turning flat and two-dimensional. Soon, I'll step into a frame of my own. Soon, I'll greet the next visitor with a painted smile and canvas-textured voice. Soon, I'll help them understand what they're really here for. But until then, I have to finish this, have to complete the record, have to ensure that everyone knows what happened to Sarah Chen, historian for the Massachusetts Historical Society, who drove 13 miles from Boston on October 15, 2024, and found a house that shouldn't exist. I dropped the book. It didn't hit the floor. It dissolved, like sugar in water, like it had never existed. But I had photos. I had proof. I ran. Out of the study, down the hall. But the hall was different now. The 17 doors had become 30, then 50. They stretched into darkness in both directions. And behind each one, I could hear something. Whispers, scratches, children laughing, children crying. One door was open, just a crack, just enough to see inside. I shouldn't have looked. God help me, I shouldn't have looked. It was my grandmother's room, exactly as I remembered it from when I was 7. Down to the quilt she made, down to the photos on her dresser, down to her sitting in her rocking chair, knitting. She looked up at me, smiled, but her eyes were black, solid black, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Stay, sweetie. Stay with Grandma. The house needs you. The house needs all of you, everyone who sees, everyone who hears, everyone who knows. But my grandmother wasn't alone. Behind her chair stood my grandfather, who'd died when I was 3. Behind him, great-aunts and great-uncles I'd only seen in photographs, an entire family reunion of the dead, all with those same black eyes, all smiling those same impossible smiles. "We've been waiting for you to come home," my grandfather said in a voice like rustling pages. "We've been keeping your place at the table, keeping your room ready. The house has been so lonely without family." I ran, harder than I've ever run. The hallway contracted and expanded like a throat swallowing. The doors slammed open and closed in rhythm, like breathing, like a heartbeat. And behind me, footsteps. Not running, walking, steady, patient, inevitable. The painted children had multiplied. Now there were dozens of them stepping out of frames I hadn't seen before, joining the procession. They weren't chasing me. They were herding me, guiding me toward something. Toward the door at the end of the hall marked Sarah's room. I made it to the stairs. They were different now. Wooden. Rotting. Each step broke under my weight, but somehow held. The portraits on the walls were watching. The Whitmore children had left their painting. They stood in the frames, three-dimensional now, reaching out. Their fingers passed through the canvas like water. Grasping, pulling, but now I could see what they were reaching for. Not me, exactly. My camera. Every time I raised it to take a photo, their hands stretched farther, their fingers growing longer, trying to touch the lens. And when they succeeded, when painted fingertips brushed against the glass, the camera grew colder, heavier, more real. More part of the house. The front door was closed, locked. The knob wouldn't turn, wouldn't even budge. Behind me, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Multiple sets now, a family's worth. I did the only thing I could think of. I lifted my camera and started taking photos. Rapid fire. The flash illuminated things I didn't want to see. Faces in the walls, bodies in the floorboards. The house wasn't built on a foundation. It was built on something else. Something that moved, something that breathed. But with each flash, the painted figures became more solid, more real, and I became more transparent. The camera was transferring something essential from me to them, feeding them with my substance, my reality, my existence. The last photo I took showed the front door opening, but I wasn't opening it. I was walking away from it, back into the house, my face already taking on that flat, painted quality, my smile already too wide, too permanent. The camera died, but the door opened. I ran to my car. It started on the first try. Miracle. I drove without looking back. The dirt road had become paved. Then it became a highway. Then I was on Route 2, doing 90, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. But in my rearview mirror, I could see them. The painted figures standing in the road behind me, waving goodbye. Getting smaller with distance, but never disappearing completely. And I realized with growing horror that they were still connected to me somehow. Invisible threads stretching from my chest back to the house, getting thinner but never breaking. I made it home. Uploaded the photos immediately, all 347 of them. Backed them up to 3 different clouds. Emailed them to colleagues. I had proof. I had evidence. But when I looked at them, they were changing. The first photo showed the gate. Normal. The second showed the path. Normal. The third showed the house. But in the windows, faces, pressed against the glass. Dozens of them, hundreds. All the people who had found the house over the years, all the people who had fed it. And in each subsequent photo, they were getting closer to the camera. By photo 50, they were on the porch. By photo 100, they were in the yard. By photo 200, they filled the frame. And in the last photo, the one I don't remember taking, the one that couldn't exist because it was taken from inside my car, looking back at me driving away, they were in the back seat, all of them. The Whitmore children, my grandmother, the surveyor from 1834, the teenagers from 1951, the urban explorers from 2003, all watching, all waiting, all smiling. But the most terrifying thing wasn't that they were there. It was that in the photo, I was smiling too, the same painted smile, the same canvas-textured face. I was already becoming one of them, even as I fled. I've tried deleting the photos, they come back. I've tried destroying my camera, I bought a new one, and they're on it. Preloaded, waiting, and they're spreading. Everyone I sent them to has seen them now, has shared them, has asked about the location. The sharing happens automatically now. My computer sends the photos to new people every night. My phone uploads them to social media platforms I don't remember joining. The house is building its own network, using my digital footprint as a roadmap to find new visitors. I've been getting emails, texts, calls. People want to know where the house is. They say they feel drawn to it. They say they dream about it. They say their children have been drawing it perfectly, even though they've never seen it. And the worst part? The absolute worst part? I've been checking historical records, compulsively, obsessively. The Massachusetts Historical Society has no record of me. Sarah Chen never worked there, never existed. My apartment lease is in someone else's name. My car is registered to a woman who died in 1743, Elizabeth Whitmore. My reflection has been changing too. In mirrors, in windows, in any reflective surface, I look more and more like a painting. My features are becoming flatter, more stylized. My eyes are losing their depth. My smile is permanent now, carved into my face like it was painted there. I'm fading. From records, from memory. Soon, I'll only exist in those photos. Another face in the window, another voice in the walls, another story no one will believe. But you listening to this, you've seen them now. The photos. I know you have because I included them. They're in your mind now. Every time you close your eyes, you'll see that house. Every time you drive past woods, you'll wonder if that's the road. Every time your GPS recalculates, you'll think about turning, about exploring, about finding it. It's exactly 13 miles from Boston, but Boston is everywhere now. Every city has a 13-mile radius. Every town has a dirt road. Every wood has a stone pillar. The house is spreading. Through the photos, through this story, through you, and when you find it, and you will find it. Remember what I said. Remember what I tried to warn you about. The house doesn't exist in any records because it exists outside of them, outside of time, outside of memory. But inside it's always October 15th, always feeding time, always waiting for the next family reunion. I can hear them calling me now. The children, they're saying it's time to come home. Time to join the family album. Time to be cataloged properly. My camera just turned on by itself. It's taking photos of my room, of my things, of me, adding me to the collection, making me part of the record that doesn't exist. The painted girl is here now, standing in my doorway, her canvas face kind and patient. "It's time," she says. "You've done such good work spreading the word. Now you can rest. Now you can be preserved forever, just like us." Isn't that what historians want? To become part of history themselves? If you're smart, you'll stop listening now. You'll forget this story. You'll delete this video. You'll pretend you never heard about the house 13 miles from Boston. But you won't. Will you? You're already wondering, already searching, already planning your drive. The GPS is already recalculating. The road is already waiting. The gate is already open. And the Whitmore children, they're already setting your place at the table. "Welcome to the family reunion. We've been expecting you." Wait, do you hear that? That scratching sound? Like something trying to get through? Look at your walls. Look carefully. Do you see them? The faces? They're very faint at first, but once you see them, they become clearer. They're in every photo now, every screen, every reflection. The house found a new way to spread, through stories, through voices, through the space between words. You invited it in when you started listening. And now it knows where you are. Check your photos, the ones on your phone. I bet there's some you don't remember taking. Photos of woods, of dirt roads, of a gate covered in roses and thorns. And if you look closely, very closely, you'll see yourself walking through it. walking toward a house that's been waiting for you for almost 300 years. The Whitmores are having another family reunion, and everyone who listened, everyone who heard, everyone who knows, is invited. See you at dinner. Try not to be late. The children get so hungry when they have to wait. And they've been waiting for you, specifically you, since 1743. Look behind you, right now, just a quick glance. Did you see the painted girl, standing just outside your peripheral vision? Smiling her canvas smile? Don't worry, she's not there to hurt you, she's there to guide you home. Story number 3. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because after tonight, you'll never look at an empty zoo exhibit the same way again. My name is Marcus, and I worked the night shift at the Bronx Zoo for 3 years. 3 years of walking those paths after dark. 3 years of checking on animals when the crowds were gone. And 3 years of avoiding Cage 4 in the Asian forest section. But last Tuesday, I finally understood why that exhibit has been empty since 1987, and why it's never, ever quiet. If you're listening to this in bed right now, maybe grab something to hold on to, because what happened to me last week proves that some cages are meant to stay empty. The story begins now. The rain hadn't stopped since Monday morning. That steady October drizzle that makes everything in New York feel heavier somehow. I pulled into the employee parking lot at 10:47 p.m., already dreading my shift. The Bronx Zoo after hours isn't what you'd expect. No cheerful music, no kids laughing. Just 400 acres of darkness punctuated by the occasional animal call that reminds you you're not alone. Tommy was waiting for me at the security office. His Yankees cap pulled low over his eyes. He'd been working nights here for 15 years. Seen everything there was to see, or so I thought. "Marcus," he said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Got a special assignment for you tonight." I poured myself coffee from the ancient Mr. Coffee machine, the same one that had been gurgling away since probably 1995. The bitter liquid tasted like it had been sitting there since my last shift. "What's up?" "Construction crews coming tomorrow morning. They need someone to check the structural integrity of..." He paused, just for a second. "Cage 4. The coffee mug stopped halfway to my lips. In 3 years, I'd never been assigned to check Cage 4. Nobody was. It wasn't officially off limits or anything. We just didn't go there. An unspoken rule, like not whistling in a graveyard or walking under ladders. "Why?" I asked, setting the mug down harder than necessary. Coffee splashed onto the desk, forming a dark stain on Tommy's paperwork. Tommy finally looked up. His eyes had that tired look of someone who'd been carrying secrets too long. Dark circles underneath, the kind that come from years of interrupted sleep and things you wish you could forget. Board wants to finally do something with it. Either renovate or tear it down. Insurance company needs a night inspection report before the crew arrives at 6 a.m. He handed me a flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that could double as a weapon. The metal was cold against my palm, heavier than it should have been. "Just take photos, check for structural damage, and..." He hesitated again, his fingers drumming nervously against the desk. "Don't stay longer than you need to." There was something in his voice, a warning that went deeper than workplace safety protocols. "Tommy, is there something you're not telling me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the security monitors that showed empty pathways snaking through the zoo. The cameras switched views every few seconds. Children's playground, tiger exhibit, sea lion pool, all abandoned and eerily peaceful under the yellow security lights. "Just be careful, Marcus, and if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get out of there. The insurance report can wait until daylight if it has to." The Asian forest section sits on the eastern edge of the zoo, past the butterfly garden and the red panda exhibit. During the day, it's beautiful. All wooden walkways and carefully maintained habitats designed to look like natural forest. At night, it's different. The path lights create pools of yellow that make the shadows between them seem deeper, darker, like the darkness is alive, pressing against the edges of the light, waiting for its chance to swallow everything whole. I could hear the red pandas chittering softly as I passed their enclosure. Even they seemed quieter than usual tonight. Usually, Mei Xing would be pacing near the front of her habitat when she heard footsteps, hoping for an after-hours treat. Tonight, she was huddled in the back corner, her bright eyes reflecting my flashlight beam as she watched me pass. Animals know things we don't. They sense the wrongness in the air before we do. The rain had picked up, pattering against the leaves overhead, creating a constant whisper that followed me down the path. Each drop seemed to carry words I couldn't quite understand, conversations in a language that predated human speech. My boots squelched against the wet asphalt, the sound echoing off the exhibit walls in ways that seemed to multiply my footsteps, as if I wasn't walking alone. Cage 4 sits at the end of a service road, separated from the public walkways by a chain-link fence and a sign that simply reads, "Future Exhibit Location, Coming Soon." That sign's been there since I started. Tommy once mentioned it had been there since the 90s. The metal was rust-stained now, the words barely legible through decades of weather and neglect. The cage itself, it's not really a cage anymore. It's more like a concrete and steel structure about the size of a small house, with thick bars across the front and reinforced glass windows that have long since been painted over from the inside. The paint was black, but in the shifting light of my flashlight, it seemed to move, to ripple like water disturbed by an invisible hand. The plaque that once identified what animal lived there has been removed, leaving just 4 screw holes in the concrete. Even those holes seemed wrong somehow, too perfectly round, too deep, as if they had been drilled by something other than human tools. I unlocked the service gate, the chain rattling louder than seemed necessary in the quiet night. The sound echoed strangely, bouncing off the exhibit walls and returning as something almost musical, like wind chimes made of bone. My flashlight beam cut through the rain, illuminating the structure. Vines had grown up one side, but other than that, it looked remarkably well preserved for something abandoned in 1987. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound like breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing coming from inside the exhibit. But not animal breathing. It was too deliberate, too aware. Like someone consciously controlling each inhale and exhale, counting the seconds between them. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. The pattern was hypnotic, almost musical in its precision. I stopped, rain dripping off my zoo-issued windbreaker. Every instinct told me to turn around, file a report saying the structure was unsafe without inspection. But I needed this job. My daughter Emma was starting college next year. SUNY purchase, art program, $32,000 a year. Her acceptance letter was still pinned to my bedroom mirror at home, next to a photo of her at her high school art show, standing proudly next to a painting of a tiger that seemed to watch you from every angle. I approached the cage, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to hold me back. The door to cage 4 wasn't locked. That should have been my first real warning. Everything at the zoo is locked. Double locked, usually. But the handle turned easily in my hand, the metal cold and slightly greasy, like it had been touched recently. The grease felt organic somehow, leaving a residue on my palm that I couldn't wipe away no matter how hard I rubbed it against my jacket. The smell hit me immediately. Not decay or animal waste, but something else, like copper pennies and wet concrete and something sweet, sickly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot in summer heat. It was the kind of smell that coated the inside of your nose and throat, making each breath feel thick and wrong. My flashlight beam swept across the interior. The space was divided into two sections, a larger front area that would have been visible to zoo visitors, and a smaller back section, probably designed as a sleeping area or shelter for whatever had lived here. The concrete walls were stained with age, dark patches that could have been water damage or something else. The stains had patterns to them like Rorschach tests made of shadow and moisture. In one, I could swear I saw the silhouette of a person reaching toward something just out of frame. In the corner of the front section, I noticed something that made me pause. Scratch marks, deep gouges in the concrete that formed patterns, almost like letters, but not quite. Like someone had been trying to write something but couldn't quite remember how letters worked. Or like something that had never been human was trying to communicate in human symbols, getting close but never quite achieving meaning. I took out my phone to photograph them for the report. The screen's glow seemed pathetically small against the encompassing darkness. The camera flash illuminated the space for a split second, and in that brief moment, I saw something move in the back section. Just a shadow, maybe, or a trick of the light. But it looked like someone standing perfectly still, facing the wall. The posture was wrong, though, too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin positioned by someone who had only heard human posture described secondhand. "Hello?" My voice cracked slightly. "Someone there? This is zoo security." Nothing. Just that breathing sound again, slightly louder now. In, out. In, out. Perfectly timed, like someone counting. But the rhythm was off by just a fraction of a second, making it sound almost human, but not quite. Like a recording of breathing played at the wrong speed. I stepped further inside, my wet boots squeaking against the concrete floor. The sound was absorbed wrong by the space, muffled in some places and amplified in others, creating an acoustic map of emptiness that my brain couldn't quite process. The back section was separated by metal bars, with a door that stood slightly ajar. Common sense told me not to go in there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen told me not to go in there. But I needed to complete the inspection. I needed that college tuition money. Emma's future depended on this job, on my ability to do what needed to be done, even when everything inside me screamed to run. The door groaned as I pushed it open. That classic haunted house sound that would be cliché if it wasn't happening to me, right then, in real life. The hinges protested like they were in pain, metal scraping against metal with a sound that seemed to last far longer than it should have. My flashlight beam swept across the smaller space, revealing photographs. Hundreds of them tacked to the walls, old Polaroids, their edges yellowed with age. I stepped closer, trying to make out what they depicted in the beam of my flashlight. They were all of the same thing, the same exhibit. Cage 4, but from different angles, different times of day. Some showed it with people standing in front, families smiling, kids pointing. But in every single photo, there was something in the cage. A dark shape that didn't quite make sense. Not an animal, but not nothing either. Like someone had taken a black marker and scribbled over that part of each photo, but three-dimensionally. Does that make sense? It doesn't to me either, but that's what I saw. The photos seemed to span decades. I could tell by the clothing styles, the hairstyles, the quality of the film. 70s families in bell-bottoms and wide lapels. 80s kids in neon colors. 90s teenagers with flannel shirts tied around their waists. And in every era that same dark, impossible shape lurking behind the bars. One photo caught my attention. It was newer than the others, the colors still vivid. It showed a man in a zoo uniform standing in front of Cage 4. I recognized him. Danny Torretti, a night guard who'd quit about 6 months ago. Said he was moving to Florida, something about his mom being sick. But in the photo, he wasn't smiling. His eyes were wide, staring at something behind the camera, and his mouth was open like he was screaming. His hands were pressed against the glass of the exhibit, and I could see that his fingers were bleeding, leaving smears on the painted surface. That's when I noticed the date stamp on the photo, October 15th, 2024, last Tuesday. A week ago exactly, but Danny had quit in April. The breathing sound suddenly stopped. The silence was worse somehow, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I turned around slowly, my flashlight beam shaking slightly in my grip. There was writing on the wall behind me. Fresh writing, still wet, the letters dripping down the concrete. But it wasn't paint. It remembers what it was. The liquid was dark red in my flashlight beam, thick and viscous. It smelled like copper and salt and something else. Something organic and wrong. As I watched, more words began to appear, letter by letter, as if written by an invisible hand. It knows what you are. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The main area of the cage seemed different now, darker, despite my flashlight. The scratch marks on the walls looked deeper, more deliberate. And that smell, that sweet, rotting smell, was getting stronger, mixing with the metallic scent of whatever was writing on the walls. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from Tommy. "You okay? Cameras show you went in 20 minutes ago." 20 minutes? It had felt like 5 at most. I looked at my phone's clock, 12:47 a.m., but that couldn't be right. I'd entered the cage at 12:30. My phone must be malfunctioning. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. Really saw it for the first time. In the corner where the shadows were deepest, something was standing. Not quite human, not quite animal, not quite anything definable. It was like looking at a person through heavy static, their features constantly shifting, never quite resolving into something recognizable. Sometimes it looked like a man in a zoo uniform. Sometimes it looked like nothing at all. Sometimes it looked like me. It spoke, or maybe I just heard it in my head. The voice was like autumn leaves scraping across concrete, like wind through bare branches, like the last breath of something dying. "You're the first one in so long who stayed to look at the photos." I should have run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of there, to sprint back to the security office and never look back. But something about that voice, it wasn't threatening. It was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely. The kind of loneliness that comes from decades of existing without being acknowledged, of being something that everyone knows is there, but no one dares to see. "What?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the humid air. "What are you?" The shape in the corner shifted, and for a moment, just a moment, I could see features. A face that might have been human once. Eyes that held too much pain for any living thing to bear. The eyes were the worst part. They were aware. Completely, terrifyingly aware of what had happened to them. "I was Marcus too," it said, and my blood turned to ice water. "Marcus Chen, 1987. I was a zookeeper here, specialized in endangered species. Do you know what we kept in this cage?" I shook my head, unable to speak. My mouth felt full of cotton and copper pennies. "Nothing," it whispered. "We kept nothing because that's what I became." The shape moved closer, and I could see it more clearly now. It was like looking at a person through layers of glass, each layer showing a different version, a different possibility. Young, old, alive, dead, all superimposed on each other. Sometimes I saw a man in his 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands from years of caring for animals. Sometimes I saw a corpse, decomposed beyond recognition. Sometimes I saw an empty space shaped like a person. "There was an accident," it continued, "or maybe it wasn't, The details... It paused, as if trying to remember. The details fade, but I was here, cleaning the exhibit. We were preparing it for a new arrival. A clouded leopard from Thailand. Beautiful creature. Never made it here. The photos on the walls began to flutter, as if stirred by a wind I couldn't feel. The sound they made was like whispered conversations, like secrets being shared in a language I didn't understand. Something went wrong with the containment system. The doors, they sealed. Electronic lock malfunction, they said later. But I was already gone by then. Not dead, not alive, just caught. Between what was and what should have been. I found my voice finally. The zoo, they know about you? That sound again, like laughing, but filtered through decades of sadness. They know something happened. Why do you think the exhibit's been empty for 37 years? Why do you think they painted over the windows? Why do you think... It gestured to the photos. Why do you think everyone who comes here at night ends up like Danny? What happened to Danny? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He's here. The thing that had been Marcus Chen said simply. They're all here. Everyone who stayed too long, who looked too closely, who tried to understand. They become part of it, part of the nothing that lives in Cage 4. I looked at the photos again, and now I could see them. Shadows within shadows, shapes that didn't quite exist, but were undeniably there. Dozens of them, maybe more. Each one a person who had walked into this cage and never walked out. Each one a life that had become unlife. Existence without existence. But you're different, it continued, moving closer still. I could feel cold radiating from it, like standing in front of an open freezer. You have a daughter, Emma, starting college next year. My heart stopped. How do you... I know, because you know. Because when you're nothing, you can see everything. Every thought, every fear, every hope of every person who walks these paths at night. It's maddening, knowing everything and being nothing. The temperature in the cage dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the air. Frost began forming on the metal bars, creating delicate patterns that looked almost like writing, almost like the same desperate scratches on the concrete walls. I had a daughter, too, it whispered. Sarah. She'd be 44 now? 45? She stopped coming to look for me after the first year, moved to California, became a teacher, married a man named David, 2 kids, never talks about her father who disappeared at the zoo. The pain in its voice was unbearable. I wanted to comfort it somehow, but how do you comfort something that shouldn't exist? How do you console someone who exists in the spaces between reality? She has a daughter now, it continued. My granddaughter, Lily. She's 8. Loves to draw, just like Sarah did when she was little. Sometimes, when the wind is right, when the barriers between worlds grow thin, I can see her through Sarah's eyes, see her coloring at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration. She doesn't know about me. Sarah made sure of that. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you have a choice, it said. Stay and become part of this, part of the nothing, or leave. Leave now and never come back. Never work another night shift. Never ask about Cage 4. Forget you ever saw this. But my job, your job isn't worth this. Trust me. I've had 37 years to think about what's worth what. I looked at my phone. 11:43 p.m. I'd been in the cage for almost an hour, though it still felt like minutes. Tommy had sent 3 more texts, each more urgent than the last. The last one simply said, "Get out now." "If I leave," I said slowly, "what happens to you?" The shape that had been Marcus Chen flickered, like a TV with bad reception. The same thing that's been happening. I wait. I exist without existing. I remember without remembering, until they finally tear this place down, and maybe then I'll be free, or maybe I'll just move to wherever the rubble ends up. I don't know anymore. I started backing toward the door, my flashlight beam wavering. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Don't be sorry, it said. Just remember. Remember that some cages aren't meant to hold animals. Some are meant to hold the spaces between things, the moments that fall through cracks in reality. And sometimes, it paused, and for just a second I saw him clearly. Marcus Chen, 30 years old, wearing a zoo uniform just like mine, his eyes full of terror and understanding. Sometimes those moments have names. I made it to the door, my hand on the handle, when everything changed. The photos on the walls began moving, not flying off or anything dramatic like that, but the images within them started to shift. I watched as the dark shapes in each picture became clearer, more defined. They were all people. Zoo workers, construction crews, security guards. Dozens of them over the years, all caught in that same space between existing and not. Wait, the thing that had been Marcus called out. And its voice was different now. Multiple voices, actually. A chorus of everyone who'd been trapped here. You can't leave. I froze. You said I had a choice. I did, but they don't agree. The temperature dropped even further. Ice crystals formed on my eyelashes, my breath coming out in thick clouds. The photos began to peel off the walls, swirling around me like a tornado of frozen memories. Every one of us had someone waiting, another voice said. Danny's voice. Every one of us had a reason to leave. But the cage, it needs watchers. It needs witnesses. Otherwise what? I shouted over the sound of rustling photographs. Otherwise it spreads, an older voice answered. A woman's voice. The nothing spreads. Cage 4 is a containment unit, Mr. Williams. Not for an animal, for a gap. A hole in the world that appeared in 1987 when Marcus Chen died and didn't die. We stay here to keep it from growing. I understood then. The empty exhibit, the painted-over windows, the unspoken rule about avoiding it. The zoo knew. Maybe not the details, but they knew enough to keep people away. Except for nights like this when someone had to check. Someone had to make sure the cage was still doing its job. But Tommy sent me here, I protested. He knew. Tommy sends someone every 6 months, Marcus's voice said sadly. Someone with a family. Someone who needs the job badly enough to not ask questions. Usually they run before it's too late, but sometimes they stay, and the cage gets a new guardian. My phone rang. Tommy calling. I answered with numb fingers. Marcus, get out of there now. His voice was strained, urgent. I'm sorry, I didn't think. Danny's mom just called me. She said Danny called her tonight, said he was at work. Marcus, Danny's been missing for 6 months. Get out now. But it was too late. I could feel it. The pull of the nothing. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling that strange urge to jump. Not because you want to die, but because the void calls to you. The space between the bars of Cage 4 seemed to stretch, to widen, inviting me to step through into, what, non-existence? Or something worse? Your daughter, Marcus's voice whispered, and suddenly I could see her. Emma, painting in her room, her college acceptance letter pinned to the wall. She needs you to exist, to be real, to be there. The pull lessened slightly. But if you leave, the woman's voice added, someone else will come. Someone else's parent, someone else's child. The cage always needs a guardian. I thought about Emma, about her art, her dreams, her future, about the parent-teacher conferences I'd attended alone after her mom left, about the late nights helping with homework, the driving lessons, The talks about boys and broken hearts and dreams that seemed too big for the world. And I thought about Marcus Chen's daughter, who never got to say goodbye. There has to be another way, I said. There has to be. And then I remembered something. Something Tommy had said. The board wants to finally do something with it. Either renovate or tear it down. Tear it down, I whispered. Then louder, they're going to tear it down. The voices went silent. The photos stopped swirling. If they tear it down, Marcus's voice said slowly, we don't know what happens. The nothing might disappear. Or it might spread, I finished. It might spread everywhere. But I had an idea. A desperate, probably stupid idea. But it was all I had. What if, I said, pulling out my phone, what if people knew? What if everyone knew? I started recording. The cage, the photos, the shadows that shouldn't exist. I couldn't capture them directly. The nothing doesn't show up on camera, but I could capture the evidence. The frost in October. The photos from impossible dates. My own testimony. If I post this, I said, if it goes viral, they can't tear it down. Not without explaining what's been here all along. The board won't risk the lawsuit, the publicity. They'll leave it standing. Seal it better, maybe, but leave it standing. And us? Danny's voice asked. Do we just stay? You stay, I said, still recording. But not alone, not forgotten. People will know. They'll remember. They'll tell stories about Cage 4, about the people who guard the nothing. You won't be nothing anymore. You'll be legend. The silence, stretched for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, the photos began to settle back onto the walls. The temperature rose slightly, and in the corner, the shape that had been Marcus Chen solidified just enough for me to see him nod. Go, he said. Post your video. Tell your story. But remember, the cage needs guardians, and one day, when you're old, when your daughter doesn't need you anymore, we'll still be here, waiting. I backed out of the cage, still recording. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. As I reached the door, I turned for one last look. They were all visible now, just for a moment. Dozens of people, all standing together in that impossible space. They weren't smiling, but they weren't screaming either. They were just watching, waiting, guarding the gap in the world that Cage 4 had become. Thank you, Marcus Chen said, and his voice was almost human again. For seeing us, for remembering we were real. I ran then. Ran through the rain, past the sleeping animals, back to the security office where Tommy was waiting with coffee and guilty eyes. I showed him the video, made him watch every second. His face went pale, then gray, then a sick green color. Jesus Christ, he whispered. I knew something was wrong, but this... You're going to recommend they keep it standing, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. And you're going to quit. Tomorrow, I agreed. After I post this. I did quit. Found a day job at a hardware store in Yonkers. Pays less, but Emma's financial aid came through better than expected. SUNY Purchase gave her a partial scholarship based on her portfolio. We'll make it work. The video, it did go viral. 3 million views in the first week. The zoo released a statement calling it an elaborate hoax, of course. But Cage 4 is still standing. They've added more locks, more cameras, more warning signs. They've stopped sending night guards to check on it. Sometimes, late at night, I check the comments on the video. Most people think it's fake. Good special effects, they say. Creative storytelling. But sometimes someone comments who knows. Another night worker, another guard who was sent to check on Cage 4 and ran. They know the truth. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about Marcus Chen and the others. Still there, still guarding that impossible space, I think about what he said. about returning when I'm old, when Emma doesn't need me anymore. I hope that day never comes. But if it does, well, at least I know they're not really nothing. They're the space between heartbeats, the pause between words, the moment between sleeping and waking. They're the guardians of the gap. And cage 4, it's still empty, but it's never, ever quiet. If you're still listening, if you made it this far, do me a favor. Next time you're at a zoo, any zoo, and you see an empty exhibit, one that's been empty for too long, don't ask why. Don't investigate. Just remember this story. Remember that some cages aren't meant to hold animals. Some are meant to hold the places where reality forgot to exist. And sometimes, those places need guardians. Sweet dreams. And whatever you do, don't visit the Bronx Zoo after midnight. The red pandas might be sleeping, but cage 4 never sleeps. It just waits, and watches, and remembers what it was supposed to be. The nothing is patient. The nothing is hungry. And the nothing always needs new guardians. Are you still awake? Good. Stay that way. It's safer. But before you go, let me tell you one more thing. Something I didn't mention before because I wasn't sure it was real, but it's been haunting me for weeks now, and I think you need to know. The morning after I quit, I drove past the zoo one last time, just to see, just to make sure cage 4 was still standing. And it was, but there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. There was a new photo tacked to the fence, a Polaroid, edges already yellowing despite being only hours old. It showed me, standing in the security office with Tommy, holding my phone up to show him the video. But in the background, visible through the office window, was cage 4. And inside the cage, barely visible but undeniably there, was my reflection. Not me, my reflection. Standing perfectly still, facing the wall, in that same rigid posture I'd seen the night before. I tore the photo down, crumpled it up, threw it away. But when I got home, it was there on my kitchen table, smooth and flat as if it had never been disturbed. And sometimes, when I catch a glimpse of myself in mirrors or windows for just a split second, I see that same rigid posture, that same wrong stillness. I'm hoping it's just trauma, just my mind playing tricks after what I experienced. But deep down, I know the truth. The cage doesn't just need guardians. Sometimes, it makes them, and maybe some parts of us never really leave. Sweet dreams. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, soft where wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you. Does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? It waits for the ritual, the brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up. That's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow. A faint creak on the floorboards. The sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different. Not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you. Still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still. Let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you. And comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, software wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you. Does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? Number. It waits for the ritual, the brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up, that's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow, a faint creak on the floorboards, the sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different. Not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you. Still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still, let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you, and comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can.